I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do.
Excuse me, Laurie.
Oh, Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. We continue the spooky season editions of the show. This time, we'll be hearing from writer and film critic Nathan Wardinski, author of Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust, a book that offers a critical reappraisal and analysis of one of the most controversial films of all time, the Italian shocker Cannibal Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato. In many ways, the film is a precursor to the found footage phenomena that many associate with the Blair Witch Project, and the film is rather controversial for having included footage of real-life animal slaughter. Most of the discussion on the animal slaughter aspect of the film is on the back end of this conversation. I know some people probably don't want to hear about all of that, but that'll be discussed for the most part in the latter portion of the conversation. And I do think it's a very interesting conversation. This is a film that I do believe deserves analysis. When you really pick it apart, there's a lot to it, even if it is considered part of the exploitation genre. And again, I understand why it's a very controversial film, but I think you'll find this conversation interesting in the way Nathan sort of looks at the film, analyzes it. There's a lot of meat on the bone with this one. But before we get to the conversation with Nathan Wardinski, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that helps make this show possible, alongside my one and only sponsor, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. Outside of Mike's generous sponsorship of this program, it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also, check out the work of Mike Swanson at wallstreetwindow.com, an excellent trading and financial newsletter. If you sign up to the newsletter right now, you can also get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. I've actually had listeners tell me that they've made return on investment from Mike's trading tips. So, you may want to check out wallstreetwindow.com if you're into stock trading or just looking to keep up with financial news. So, with that being said, check out wallstreetwindow.com, and let's get to the conversation with Nathan Wardinski on Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very interested to be speaking with. We've been planning this out for a long time. There's been problems scheduling it on my end. So I'm so happy he was able to work with me and we're finally able to speak. I'm talking with Nathan Wardinski, author of Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust, which is one of the most controversial, I would say, Italian horror films out there. It shocked viewers and provoked a lot of censorship with this graphic imagery and unrelenting nihilism. So we're going to be talking about Cannibal Holocaust, and of course, if people aren't familiar with it, we'll get into why this movie was so just shocking to people at the time and why it still has this impact. But first, how are you doing, Nathan? And maybe you could fill in any blanks when it comes to Cannibal Holocaust if people were unfamiliar with the film.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Yes, my name's Nathan Wardinski. I wrote this book, Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust, which is an analysis of the motion picture originally released in 1980. Cannibal Holocaust was part of a trend of cannibal films primarily produced by Italian filmmakers in the 1970s and 80s. And the overall formula that these films usually follow is that white explorers go into the jungle, they encounter cannibalistic tribes, people are raped, murdered, and eaten, and then usually one person escapes. Cannibal Holocaust was the most famous and infamous of these movies, and it was distinct partly for its narrative, which was a frame narrative. It experimented with found footage before that was commonplace. This movie begins with a documentary film crew that has disappeared while filming a ethnographic picture in the Amazon, exploring cannibalistic tribes. And so an anthropologist named Harold Monroe is sent to the Amazon, and the first half of the picture plays as a normal feature in which Monroe goes to the Amazon, he follows the documentarian's trail, and he finds the evidence of what may have happened to them and encounters the tribes who not only have their remains, but also have the undeveloped film canisters. In the second half of the story, Monroe has brought the film canisters back to New York City. He's working with the network executives who had sponsored the documentarians, and we watch the footage and find out what happened uh, to them in the Amazon.
And for my listeners, what are the biggest controversies around the film? And how do you address those in the book? I mean, the big one is the issue of animal cruelty. And I've
Yes.
actually, I had a chance to ask the director about that
Oh,
when
you
he was
did?
alive, Deodato. It's not something that he's actually happy with or was happy with. He was, very weird about talking about it, and I think he regretted it.
Yeah. Well, I think he had a complicated relationship with this film, and I talk about that a bit in the book. But yeah, the animal killings are probably the main source of controversy. Um, it did feature several animals being killed, namely a snake, a cotamundi, which is misidentified as a muskrat in the film. We also get a spider, a monkey, and a pig are killed. And this was not uncommon. I mentioned that whole genre of cannibal films. Well, animal killings were commonplace in these movies. Not only that, animal killings were commonplace, relatively commonplace in Hollywood pictures of the time. So remember, the year before Cannibal Holocaust comes out, we have Apocalypse Now, which has I believe it's a water buffalo being slaughtered. A few years before that, we have Jaws and the tiger shark that's caught in about a third of the way into the movie. And Richard Dreyfuss says they caught a shark, not the shark. Well, that's a real tiger shark that was killed specifically to be used as a prop in the movie. You can go back further into the Westerns, for example, when John Wayne would be riding on his horse and shoot the Native American character, and the horse would buck and fall. That was typically achieved using tripwires. And oftentimes, well, not sometimes, the animal would break its leg and then have to be put down. Lots of horses died in the production of Westerns in their heyday in the 1950s and 60s. So this was not really an unusual thing to kill animals in movies. Uh, Cannibal Holocaust came out at a time when I think that was just starting to shift. Now, for Deodato's part, he indicated that the animal killings were included at the behest of the film's producers. And so he decided, because there had been animal killings in his previous cannibal picture, which is called Last Cannibal World, and also goes by the title Jungle Holocaust. And several animals were killed in the making of that. So what he has said in subsequent interviews is that he reasoned that they would kill animals that were going to be consumed by the locals anyway. Now, we can debate about whether or not this is appropriate, but I think the fact is that it was not unusual. But it did become the sticking point because the film got in legal trouble in Italy, and the animal killings were used as the cause for charging the filmmakers and convicting them of obscenity. Now, Deodato has, yeah, as you mentioned, expressed regret about the killing of the animals. I suspect that what he really regretted was people bitching about it for the next 40 years and having to listen to that over and over again. But like I said, Deodato's had a kind of a complicated relationship with the film. I'm curious. You said you actually spoke with him, so I'm curious. What were your
I met
impressions?
him at a convention. It
I
was
see.
very interesting for me because, you hear so much about this movie, and
Hmm.
it's considered one of the most shocking movies of all time. And just meeting Deodato, he was a very diminutive figure. Um, and just like the kindest, gentlest man I could have expected to meet. And I think he was briefly asked either by me or someone else in the Q&A section, and there was a translator there too. And he was sort of, he was very apprehensive about talking about it. That
Hmm.
was my experience with it. But what stuck out to me is, you know, he was just a very gentle human being in my experience.
Okay.
Just a very brief experience, but very sort of quiet, thoughtful man.
And
No,
and you were
even
meeting and you were meeting him decades after this had all happened. So
right,
people
right.
do change
This
and
had to be when I was like, I may have been, 16, 17 years old at the time,
mhm,
but it was a
right.
very interesting experience.
Hmm. Now the cast and crew on the set did not describe him that way. Um, Robert Kerman, who plays Professor Monroe, used the word statist to refer to Deodato. When I interviewed another one of the actors who played Alan Yates, he used the word prick to describe Deodato. Um, uh, Francesca Ciardi called him abusive. There's a moment on set when she was supposed to get naked for the camera and didn't want to. And basically, Deodato screamed at her until she agreed to take her clothes off for the camera. So
Oof.
that gives you a sense of what he was probably like, at least at the time. Um, did it help the fact that he was going through apparently a messy divorce at the time? Probably not. You could even ascribe the surplus of misogyny in the film to the headspace that he was in.
Do you
Then
think
again,
there's
he,
also the issue of, I think a lot of times directors, uh, they can make great art, but a lot of times they have to be very dictatorial on set. Like
yep.
Terry Gilliam made great movies, but he could
Hmm.
be a pain in the ass to work with on set from everything I've heard in interviews. A lot of directors have their vision and they want to get their movie done, and they can be real, I mean,
Hmm.
like you said, sometimes they can be pricks.
Yeah, I mean, Carl York was the actor I mentioned who played Alan Yates, and he said that Deodato was very good at explaining what it was that he wanted to see in a way that was very useful for the actors. So he had some talent with working with the actors, but he was also very specific. And you're dealing with low budget filmmaking, in which everything's on a shoestring budget, and time is always not on their side, and there's all those additional pressures. Plus, they're shooting on location in the Amazon. It's very hot, and you're physically arduous conditions to work in. So I'm sure not all that helped. Not that that excuses some of the things he said and did. But I mentioned that he had you said he was kind of reluctant when you spoke with him. you could really see that in some of the final interviews he did. His In the lead up to the final portion of his life, he had done Cannibal Holocaust in 1980, and the film kind of came and went at the time, and then he moved on to other stuff. And it was decades later that he discovers that there's actually a whole fan base for Cannibal Holocaust specifically. And he starts going to horror conventions and meeting with fans. And he embraces the identity as the guy who directed Cannibal Holocaust. But in one of his final interviews, Deodato expressed some more ambivalent feelings that he maybe felt a little resentful for the fact that he was going to be remembered as the Cannibal Holocaust guy. Um, and that he had done, because remember, he had done a lot of work. He had directed in all sorts of films. He had directed in all sorts of genres. He had worked in television. He had worked with Roberto Rossellini and other neorealist filmmakers from the 1960s and 70s. He'd had a really interesting, robust career, but this is the thing he was going to be remembered for. But that's not unusual. Filmmakers, in their twilight years of their life or career, start to sort of revise and try to sort of direct their memory and their legacy.
Yeah, I did want to talk a little bit more about Deodato. Is What else can we say about his career outside of Cannibal Holocaust, and why do you think his other films haven't gotten the same amount of attention? Because I think I mean, he was a commercial filmmaker. He made a
Yeah,
number of
he
films, and
was.
I actually find a lot of his other films interesting. House on the Edge of the Park, I thought was an
Hmm.
interesting, if
It is.
difficult movie. But it seems like a lot of his other films are forgotten outside of, real hardcore sort of cinephiles and genre enthusiasts.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality of what he made, to be honest. He was a journeyman filmmaker, sort of a filmmaker for hire, doing, as I said, all working all sorts of genres. And I think he's a filmmaker who didn't have as distinct of a style as we would kind of associate with other filmmakers that we think of, like Lucio Fulci, to, um, to think of another Italian director of that period, who had definitely had a distinct style. Uh, Deodato shifted and adjusted to whatever he was doing. He made a movie called Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man, which was one of those police films, street films from the time. And that movie definitely has an edge to it, which is probably one of the things that you find in a lot of his work. There was a violence to a lot of his films.
Now, let's talk about your experience with Cannibal Holocaust. How did you first end up seeing this movie?
So I became aware of it due to Stanley Wieter's essay, Disturbo 13, the most disturbing horror films ever made. And that was published in an anthology called Cut Horror Writers on Horror Film. And I found this when I was a freshman in college. And this was the late 90s, early 2000s. So this was that overlapping period where VHS and DVDs were still available, but streaming didn't exist yet. And uh, I treated this list as as a watch list, and I started going through it. And I was able to find about a third to half of the films at my local video store or the library. Some of the other titles included Cello, The 120 Days of Sodom, Man Behind the Sun, the original I Spit on Your Grave, the original Last House on the Left, Combat Shock, Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Eraserhead, a few others. And yeah, I was able to find a few of these at the time. Uh, Others I had to track down through eBay, and that's where I found Cannibal Holocaust, was on eBay, and may have been a pirated copy. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have it anymore. It was a VHS copy. I wish I'd kept it. But I watched that, and coincidentally, what was happening at the time was the invasion of Iraq. So I'm spending, when I'm not in class or doing other things, I'm watching CNN and I'm watching the invasion, and I watched the lead up to it. And the copy of Cannibal Holocaust arrives in my campus mailbox the same weekend that Bowling for Columbine opens at the local movie theater. And so I watched both of those movies in the weekend, same weekend. And that was an interesting juxtaposition that probably shaped the way that I looked and thought about Cannibal Holocaust. Because on the one hand, Cannibal Holocaust is about media's use of exploitation and sometimes dishonesty in its portrayal of world events and other people. It also, frankly, reflected some of the criticism of Michael Moore's documentary at the time. People were saying that that was dishonest and that that was somehow exploitative. So I think watching the WMD debacle and everything that was happening in media at the time, and also the messages about other parts of the world, that the Middle East was full of, these savage, violent people who wanted to kill us, and how those lined up quite well with the themes and images in Cannibal Holocaust. And that, remember at the time, I'm also studying radio, television, and film. So all these things sort of dovetailed together. And then I kind of sat in the film and I would revisit it every periodically. And then the DVD came out, and that was a revelation. Grindhouse releasing's initial 2-disc DVD that was packed with special features. And it got me really thinking that, okay, I think there's something worth talking about here in an in-depth way. When I worked at Winona State University, I actually sponsored a public screening of the film there. And it was very well attended. Did get a little bit of pushback from people at the time, just like, why are we showing this on campus, et cetera, which I think is a legitimate question. But I felt like I had to explain what the film was about and why it's significant and worth contemplating. And ultimately, it was going to take a book to really do that because the film is so dense with ideas and so complex in its implications about anthropology and about media, and even about nature and the disposition of human beings.
So I'll say the first time I saw it was actually, I believe it was at that same convention I met Deodato
Mm,
actually. And it was not a movie that it was not a movie that was easy to watch, and I don't
no.
think I was very sober at the time while watching it because I would have been freaking out with the animal deaths and whatnot if I had been completely sober.
Mhm.
But I guess it's a very hard film to watch. I've only seen it once or twice. I think it does have artistic merit, but like I said, since it is so hard to watch certain aspects of it, I've often find people say to me, "Well, how can you argue that there's any artistic merit? I mean, look at the animal cruelty. Um, you know, it's so exploitative in this way and that way." People will say to me, "How can you defend it?" So, have you gotten that before from people that will
A,
say,
a
"Why
bit.
even give it a critical analysis?" I mean, how do you respond to those people?
Well, a couple of things. First, I want to pick up on the phrase you used, animal cruelty. I would argue that there is no animal cruelty in Cannibal Holocaust. There's animal slaughter, but there's not animal cruelty. None of these animals are tortured. There are other films in this subgenre that I think do actually have animal cruelty. There's a sequence in which some it looks like there's like cockfighting going on or something like that. That's animal cruelty, and that you can see in some of these films, or equivalent scenarios with other kinds of animals. I think there's a snake fight in uh, Cannibal Ferox, or maybe Eaten Alive, and to me, that's animal cruelty. This is animal slaughter. The kills are relatively clean, immediate. There's a gunshot, a swift hit with the machete, etc. The only one that would come close to that is the Cotamundi, which continues to get them into trouble. In the UK, this movie was banned for a long time. The version of it available there now is cut, and the scene that they cut down was the shot of the Cotamundi being killed with the switchblade. But the rest of it, I would argue, is not actually animal cruelty. It's animal slaughter. And I think the distinction is important. Now, as to the rest of your question, why write about Cannibal Holocaust? I think the fact that the film has survived It's now part of the canon. We have filmmakers homaging this picture. Uh, I've heard the music used in the television show Euphoria and in some other motion pictures. They've
You mean
used,
that famous like acoustic uh track, the main theme,
yes,
the
the main
Riz
theme.
Ortolani. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that theme has appeared in that and in another film I saw just last year, and I'm blanking on the name. I want to say it was called The Fire. Oh,
It
skipped
doesn't
that. But
sound like a track you'd hear a lot in horror movie. That's why
no,
it's very interesting.
and these weren't horror. Um, I mean, Euphoria I wouldn't categorize as horror. Let me look up what the name of that film was. Just a second. So actually have heard Rizzo Ortolani's score used in The Fire Inside and in the television show Euphoria. The main title was played in the end credits. The film Kong Skull Island, which is a PG-13 studio picture, has a deliberate homage to Cannibal Holocaust. One of the soldiers is impaled in much the same way as the signature image of the impaled woman. Uh, and then we're starting to see other people pick it up and write about it in articles, whether it's popular articles or academic articles. My frustration had been that no one had dealt with it in depth, really, and given it, I think, the serious treatment that the film deserves. I think great art is where you find it. And I find, without hopefully overstating it, I find the world in Cannibal Holocaust. In 96 minutes, this movie, whether by intention or by accident, distilled something essential about the world, about nature, about societies and how they relate to each other, and our place in all of that. And it does so in a way that is brutal and honest, uh, and not easy to take, but I think is intelligent and merits discussion.
I want to get into the themes more, but I guess one more thing I wanted to cover was it's often been said that this is sort of the inspiration for the entire found footage genre. How true do you think that is?
There's some truth in that. I think this is an important title in that legacy. But the film's overall style and construction, you can go all the way back to Peeping Tom in 1960 for that. You can look at other films such as Punishment Park, released in the early 70s, which is a very interesting film. People, if you haven't caught up with that, they should look back at that. Punishment Park was a pseudo documentary, kind of imagining a corporal punishment being doled out to political dissidents in this country. And then going forward, you have stuff like Legend of Bogey Creek, which isn't quite found footage, but I think it merits being mentioned in that same area. And then there's things that are not horror but comedy, such as Spinal Tap, which of course is one of the great examples of that kind of filmmaking. And then going forward, I think Cannibal Holocaust disappeared for a while. It never really disappeared, but it was an underground film for a long time. And that was as a result of its prosecutions and its lack of distribution. The movie was being circulated on duped VHS tapes throughout the 80s and 90s. And that created its real authentic countercultural bona fides.
I wanted to ask you about that a little bit more in depth because do you think that the way it was so when it was being traded uh,
Mhm.
amongst tape traders in the 80s or the 90s in the days of the video nasties for elements of my British audience, I mean, people are getting dupes of dupes of dupes when they're watching this.
Mhm.
So, do you think that contributes to a lot of the mythology around the film? Because I mean, I remember
Absolutely.
watching a documentary. It was I think it was a Channel 5 or BBC series called like The Dark Side of Porn, and they did an episode on snuff, and Eli Roth was
Mhm.
actually on it of all people, saying that he thought one of the scenes was real in Cannibal Holocaust, the one of the famous impalement scene, and
Mhm.
I think there were some people that watched this movie. And they were probably watching dupes of dupes of dupes of dupes to the point
Mhm.
where they couldn't tell if that scene was real or not. And it's a very well done scene, but
Yeah.
there's this whole sort of legend that, Deodato um, ended up being prosecuted for murder, and he had to bring in the actors and show them how he did it. Do you think that whole underground tape trading and the dupes of dupes of dupes being passed around is part of the reason for the legend around this movie?
Absolutely. Yes. I think that, as I said, gave it this sort of countercultural authenticity. I think that's akin to like punk music from that time and the DIY culture from that time. It had a great underground reputation. And now we live in an era where there basically is no underground, right? But at the time, I think that helped its reputation, dovetailing in with the paranoia about snuff films. Now, I think some people watched this film and did believe it was real. It wouldn't surprise me when Blair Witch Project came out, that same thing had happened. But yeah, I should want to talk about the murder charges because this is often been spoken about. I find articles online all the time that claim that Ruggero Deodato and others were charged with murder. This is not true. Uh,
It was
and
obscenity charges.
they were obscenity charges, yes. But the sort of popular story about Cannibal Holocaust is that it opens in Italy, and the police seize the film and believe that it is documenting actual murders and that people were actually killed on the set, um, and that the crew and the cast had been told to lay low for a year, not accept any work, and that the filmmakers were deliberately trying to pull one over on the audience. Now, it's true. I think they were trying to pull one over on the audience, but the cast deny ever signing any kind of agreement to lay low. And in fact, they appear in films that came out in 1981, the following year. So this idea that they were uh, not accepting work and laying low is just nonsense. And then the whole not idea that there was a murder trial has been greatly exaggerated. There was some magazine articles published at the time that suggested that these things were real, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Something had happened a few years earlier. So there was this movie called Shark that came out with Burt Reynolds, and there's a scene in it where a shark attacks a diver. Well, pictures of this appeared in Life magazine, and they claimed that a great white shark had broken through the barriers and fatally attacked the stunt diver, and that the footage from that appeared in the movie. Well, there is a shark attack scene, but this apparently was all just a hoax, and Life magazine had the wool pulled over its eyes this time. So that may have been part of what happened when with Cannibal Holocaust and some of these magazine articles.
Can you speak at all to the obscenity trial or?
Well, the obscenity charges were interesting. This is a time in Italian film that filmmakers are really pushing the boundaries, and films are getting seized left and right because there's a fight within Italian society about the culture and where they're going to go. Pornography is still illegal at this time, for instance, and that's a fight that's playing out. Um, so Cannibal Holocaust was unique in that most films that were seized for obscenity uh, ended up being charged under the guise of being offensive to public morality, and that meant sex or religion. What was unique about Cannibal Holocaust is that it was the first time that someone had gone for obscenity charges over violence, and as a result, that's where the animal cruelty charges ended up coming up because the prosecutors found statutes that regarding the murder of animals for in public entertainment used statutes related to that, and then used that as a predicate to prosecute Cannibal Holocaust and its makers. And that resulted in a fine, and the film was withheld for a while, but did ultimately get released first with cuts and then was later on restored and released uncut.
Now, in terms of the themes of the film, the one or two times I've seen it, and like I said, it's been hard to watch for me at times, but I
Mhm.
still think there's very much something to it as a film, and I do think it has artistic merits, which is why I'm so interested in your book. What stood out to me was the way he deals with these documentarian characters. 'Cause they truly are just horrible people. They're
Mhm.
engaging in massive exploitation. So on one hand, it feels like the movie is commenting on the exploitative nature of a lot of documentary filmmakers and journalists. But in another way, it's also interesting because I almost feel like the movie is almost like a meta commentary on commercial exploitation filmmaking itself. And that is what stood out most to me. Can we talk more to that theme?
Sure. So, there was another film genre that's really important to understand in Cannibal Holocaust, in the context in which Cannibal Holocaust was made, and that's the Mondo genre. So, starting in the 1960s, a lot of filmmakers, namely Italians, again, created these travelogue films that were called Mondo films. And they were distinct from other travelogue documentaries because they emphasized sexual, violent, and scandalous behaviors of people around the world. And they sort of purported to bring this to the masses. And this is at a time, by the way, when people didn't travel as much as they do now. So there was a lot of novelty, and the signature film was Mondo Cane, which was a huge hit. Incidentally, had music by Riz Ortolani. It was directed by a couple of filmmakers, Jacopetti and Prosperi,
Right. And they made a
and
whole like trilogy. Yeah.
they made a whole bunch of movies like
Right.
this. Yes. Their other notable film was Africa Audio, which documented the last vestiges of British colonialism, leaving Africa and turning control back to the indigenous people. And this film is a horror show. I mean, if you want to talk about scenes of animals being killed, holy shit. There's scenes of lots of elephants and hippopotamuses being slaughtered. What's particularly galling about the movie is that it crisscrosses all over Africa. It doesn't specify where this stuff is taking place. There's a tendency in Western society to talk about both Africa and South America not as a network of countries that each have their own histories and cultures and unique challenges, but to look at them as just sort of an amorphous whole. And that's something that Africa Audio very much does. So those had come out and they had been huge hits. And then, of course, when things are successful, they spin imitators. And we get increasingly, we get more and more debased films. Now, something important to know about Jacopetti and Prosperi's pictures is that they did go to these locations and they did shoot, but they also fabricated stuff for the cameras. Um, and as people went on trying to create these things, they became more debased, but also more fake, kind of culminating with the series Faces of Death, which also did have some realistic stuff that was shot, newsreel footage, that kind of thing, but was often most of it was just fabricated, and that kind of signaled the end of the Mondo as we think of it. Although I would argue the Mondo genre kind of continued in the form of, world's craziest police chases and the Girls Gone Wild video series and things of that sort, which were all sort of alternate versions of Mondo. Now we have cable news, which I would argue is itself a sort of 24-hour Mondo channel.
Right. We've gone from the sort of shockumentary Mondo movie to
Mhm.
24/7 news being the new Mondo.
Yeah. So that's important. And in fact, there is This is part of the reason why you have the real animal killings being used, is that it creates a impression of reality. So the special effects artist Tom Savini, who was famous for his work on Dawn of the Dead and the original Friday the 13th and many other pictures of that era, talked about how they would create credibility with the weapon before it like chopped off the fake arm in the special effects shot. They would have a real axe and it would strike something like a piece of wood and chip something out of it, and that would give the weapon credibility, so that the audience really believed the hit when it chopped the person's arm or head off. Now, the animals are used in a similar way. So we have these human deaths, which are dramatized, but we also have these real animal deaths, and that makes us believe the reality of the human deaths that much more. It's also significant that there's a sequence in the film called The Last Road to Hell. And it's when Monroe has returned to New York, the network executives show him a clip of a previous documentary that Alan Yates and company had worked on. This footage is real. Some of it comes from the famous Idi Amin documentary from that time. And other of it is actual newsreel footage from Mondo Pictures. And this stuff is real. And there's scenes of executions and that sort of stuff. And then they stop it and they say, "Oh, this is all fake," which is an interesting choice. And you can interpret that a few different ways. Is it actually fake? Given what we find out about what Alan Yates and company did while they were in the jungle, maybe that's what the executive was told or has told herself, so that she can go to sleep at night, or at least have plausible deniability.
So can we delve into that more? You mentioned that movie Africa Audio. Um,
Mhm.
that's another film that I think it's considered a very important film, but it's also very controversial.
Mhm.
It's gotten both praise and criticism. Can you compare more? Can you compare and contrast that film more to Cannibal Holocaust? Can you go a little bit more in depth with that comparison and contrast?
Sure. I think there's some obvious comparisons. Riz Ortolani scored a lot of Jacopetti and Prosperi's films, and then he came back and he was recruited specifically for that reason to score Cannibal Holocaust. There's an interesting tension in Africa Audio in that there is scenes of that very obviously shot in a handheld manner, catching the shot as you can. And then other scenes that are pretty obviously staged, and he gets the lighting and the choreography of the subjects and the camera movement just right. And there's this tension between artificiality and authenticity, which is a tension that exists in all art, right? All art is fake, and yet we want to believe while we're watching it that it's real. Uh, However, there is a limitation to that, which we could talk about in relation to horror and violence. But I think Deodato was really enamored with what Jacopetti and Prosperi had done and was trying to bring that to uh, to this film. But he did so in a way that was a little clearer in the sense that the first half of the film that is shot in a feature style is pretty clean, whereas the second half, which is shot in 16 millimeter and is handheld, almost all of it, that stuff is deliberately scratched and made to look, authentic by ironically revealing the cinematic illusion by creating scratches in the print, for example, which are done at strategic places to kind of cover up the seams of the special effects and the editing. Uh, but paradoxically, the stuff that destroys the illusion actually makes it more real. It becomes like when an actor flubs his line in an outtake. Like we feel like suddenly we're seeing the real thing. But in this case, we're seeing something that is itself a fabrication.
Do you also want to talk about how do you view the way Cannibal Holocaust deals with colonialism and, um, these sort of white characters versus the natives. Um,
Sure.
because, one of the things that Africa Audio got criticized for was, I mean, Roger Ebert called it straight up racist. And
Hmm.
I think you can criticize Cannibal Holocaust in some ways, and just the cannibal genre in general,
Hmm.
um, as being very racist. But there's also like this critique of the white man, I think, in
Hmm.
Cannibal Holocaust. So it's a very unusual film.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about the various ethical problems of the film, and one of them is racism. And one of the comparisons I make is to the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And that's a film, or excuse me, that's a book that is critiquing the colonial system at the time and um, exposing how it doesn't work. The ships are broken down, the locals are being made to work in slave conditions, Kurtz has gone mad, etc. But at the same time, it's been pointed out that Conrad's regard for the locals, for the African people, is itself kind of racist. And I think you could find something similar in Cannibal Holocaust. Now, what I think you have to do is sort of take a macro view of this. You can reconcile that on the one hand, the film's depiction of the local people, specifically the Yanomama people, which are an actual tribe living in the Amazon. And I talk about them at length, the people as they exist and as they are depicted on screen, which are on one hand quite different. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that uh, the screenwriter did research on them, and the way he depicted them was rooted in what was published in the most popular anthropology pieces of the time. But as far as speaking about why Cannibal Holocaust is or isn't racist, I think one of the important things is to say yes, but yes, it has definitely a racially problematic component to it. That's undeniable. Um, on the other hand, what is the overall point of the film? Well, the overall point of the film is that you and I and the people over in developing world are the same. Racism is about establishing hierarchies between different groups of people. This film is obliterating that. It's saying the very last scene when uh, Professor Monroe walks out and lights his pipe and says, "I wonder who the real cannibals are." Well, it's all of us. And that's ultimately the point. And the film makes that, it's not being coy about it, really. The opening sequence is this aerial footage of the Amazon. And then that smash cuts into a equivalent high angle view of New York City. And then the newspaper reporter who's on the rooftop introducing the picture talks about savage people living in a hostile environment. Meanwhile, he's talking about the natives, but then it's showing us all this B-roll footage of New Yorkers walking the streets. And then through the film itself, we get all these parallels, primarily through the many scenes of sexual assault, in which we're first introduced to one of the native people uh, engaging in an honor killing. And then later on, we see the documentarians engaging in a similar activity, gang raping a young Native woman. And the way it's shot and some of the images are quite similar. So it keeps drawing parallels between the two groups of people, with the point being that we're all the same. Where it's not quite humanist in a sense is that it says, instead of saying we're all beautiful people, no, it's saying we're all pretty wretched
That's
because
one of the things that stood out for me in the film. I felt like this is a really brash way of putting it, and a crude way of putting it, but no one comes off good in this movie. None of the
not
characters.
not really, except maybe for Harold Monroe. And he's what I find interesting is that when I first think about this film, and and this is true of a lot of the cannibal movies, they're about a collision of cultures, but that collision of culture is the sort of industrialized Western people and the unindustrialized native people, and they're the ones who meet, right? Well, I would argue that Cannibal Holocaust is about a collision of cultures, but it's not that. It's actually Harold Monroe, the anthropologist, versus and everything he represents as an academic versus Alan Yates and the other documentarians and everything that they represent as members of the corporate media.
Can you delve into that a little bit more?
Sure, sure. So this movie comes out in the early 80s, or yeah, the early 80s, after we've had this period where universities have transformed. For a long time, at least American universities and elsewhere, they're just places where students went to learn. Well, universities become instead this hotbed of political activism. And that is partly in the humanities. Um, in the field of anthropology, you have the advent of what's called advocacy anthropology, in which anthropologists say that they cannot be neutral, that they have a responsibility to work on behalf and in the best interests of the people who that they are studying. Now, that itself is a controversial view within anthropology. Some people think that's the way that's progress. That's the way the field should go. Other people feel that that's not scientific. But nevertheless, that's a debate that's happening at the time. And you can trace sort of academia. If you want to trace it, you could trace it all the way back to ancient Greece. But academia is tied into the West's view of itself as an enlightened civilization, as a civilization that's bringing, classical liberal values to the world. Those two things are very intertwined. And then on the other hand, you have Alan Yates, who works for the corporate media. He works for this Pantheon news service. Now, interesting fact about that: there's exterior shots of the building that is the headquarters for the American network. Today, that building is the headquarters of News Corp and the Fox Corporation. Fox News is located in that building. I don't know that that was intentional because I don't think they were headquartered there at the time in 1979 when they were shooting, but it's nevertheless an interesting fact about that now that retroactively plays pretty interestingly. But at one point, Monroe, the anthropologist, is having a lunch and taking a break from watching the film footage, and he's sitting with the female network executive. And he's complaining about the footage, saying, I don't think it's authentic. I think that this is fake. And what's so extraordinary about footage of people being manipulated into doing something they wouldn't normally do? And the female network executive looks at Monroe and says, who knows anything about the Yakumo civilization? What people want is sensationalism. The more you rape their senses, the happier they are. Well, then what happens a few scenes later? The documentarian and his buddies gang rape one of the native women. So Alan Yates is acting out literally the values of the corporation. And so that's what you've got contrasted is Monroe on the one hand as this beacon of integrity and intellectual honesty. And that's what he values. He wants to know the truth about things. And he keeps saying things to that effect throughout the movie. On the other hand, you have Alan Yates, who doesn't give a damn about the truth. He just wants to get rich and get famous. And exploiting people and local cultures and obfuscating the truth is the way to do it.
That's another thing that makes it such an interesting film is that you kind of at first think Yates is a victim, but then as we get deeper and deeper into the film, we realize him and his crewmates are monsters.
Right. And that's one of the things it's interesting the film is doing, because there is this whole history of storytelling, right? That we can trace back. In the book, I trace back Cannibal Holocaust's sort of narrative lineage, and I trace it back not only to Mondo films, but specifically to westerns and to the jungle adventure movies that were made in the 30s. And we can also trace it back to colonialist literature like Robinson Crusoe and those kinds of stories. And there is a sort of racism built into those stories, and that the audience has internalized from living in this culture, right? And these are the stories we consume, and we kind of internalize this subtext. What Cannibal Holocaust does that's so interesting is that it starts off by sort of affirming that and taking on that look. The first half of the movie, which plays like a regular feature film, plays like a kind of standard jungle adventure movie, which a lot of the other cannibal films were. And then it's the second half, it reverts that. And it makes us consider, wait a minute, what have we seen? There's a sequence that starts off the film in which the natives are crouching in the jungle and they're eating these human remains. And the local soldiers go and gun these guys down, all but one who becomes then the captive. Uh, that scene is interesting to me when I think about the Western and where it was. So the one of the essential Westerns of the classical Western period is Stagecoach, John Ford's movie. And that movie ends with the people in the stagecoach are being chased by Native Americans. And the Native Americans are going to swarm them and presumably kill them until the cavalry shows up and wipes out the Native Americans, and the people traveling across the frontier are saved. Fast forward a few years later, and we get a movie called Soldier Blue. Soldier Blue dramatizes at the end the Sand Creek Massacre, in which the United States cavalry murdered a whole tribe of Native Americans, including women and children. So it's effectively like the same image, but the meaning is different. So Cannibal Holocaust, instead of ending on that massacre, it starts there. And how we think about what it is that we've seen depends on what you bring in with you and what your perspective is from the beginning of the film to the end and the way that it's changed. And that's a very interesting and complicated trajectory for the film to take that really goes well beyond what we would expect from this kind of an exploitation film.
I wanted to talk more about that in the sense of I think one of your biggest arguments is that this is a much more complex film than its reputation.
Mhm.
I think some people just look at the surface level of it,
Yeah.
uh, violence, etc., and they're missing the way the narrative structure is structured is actually more complex than what you would
Mhm.
expect from a commercial exploitation movie.
Let me say, I don't blame people for that because, first off, I think they have certain preconceptions about exploitation movies, about low culture, and also the fact that the film is so violent and so extreme. It just becomes too much noise to make sense of that, especially on the first viewing.
Can you speak more to that, the complexity of the narrative and how it's structured?
Well, you've got a frame narrative to begin with, and frame narratives are always about commenting on what's on the inside frame, right? So it's all about setting up our expectations uh, based on what has come before. That's it. Cannibal Holocaust is very reliant on this narrative tradition that goes back all the way into colonialist literature, Robinson Crusoe, as I mentioned, and is then using that to comment on the present. I think one of the other thing that's relevant to understanding it is the Vietnam War and the news footage of soldiers in combat. In some ways, we haven't really seen that since. The closest kind of we've gotten to that has been not through official media channels, but online in the news footage coming back from Gaza, in which we've seen horrific images being distributed, specifically not by commercial or corporate media, but by independent media, which I think is an interesting development. But as far as the narrative structure is concerned, I think it's not to be redundant here, but I think it's relying on uh, our preconceptions walking in and then subverting them. I think also the use of all these different sources. So not only using um, the different film stocks, 35 in the outer frame, 16 in the inner frame, but also using that Mondo footage that I mentioned earlier. I think you get this sort of mix of different medias that is really interesting. It's stitched together in part by the music score, which runs consistent through the whole thing, and it becomes another way of thinking uh, consistently about it. So one of my favorite examples in the film is the use of music in the turtle scene when the turtle is uh, executed and then chopped apart and then cooked. That same musical cue is used when Jack, the photographer with the blonde hair, is killed. And the imagery of the axe hits chopping up Jack's abdomen are remarkably similar to the shots being used in the turtle sequence of them using the machete to hack up the turtle's shell. And then you have the same music playing over it. So it's in a way that links the two pieces together, not only those sequences, but both of those narrative pieces. It creates sort of a coherent whole.
I know you've used the term like the cannibal fiction master narrative in some other interviews. Can you speak to that as well and how the movie interrogates that?
Well, right. So master narratives are stories that, or story formulas that cut across generations and are sort of the fundamental building blocks of what we have. So you can think about the captivity narrative, which is not relevant so much to Cannibal Holocaust, but it is relevant to the cannibal genre as a whole. Um, and that is something that there were often stories that were published and circulated widely in the early centuries of America that of people who had been sort of kidnapped by Native Americans and told stories of their escape while they were being held. And a lot of these other cannibal stories do fall into that. And it's the presumption that there is someone or something out there that's going to get us, you know? And that theme runs through uh, the jungle adventure stories. It runs through the westerns, and it runs through It's definitely something that's informing the Mondo films. The Mondo movies are full of all these images of, uh, angry or frenzied black people or brown people acting violently in front of the camera. And kind of the implicit message of this was that now that colonialism is over, there's no check on I mean this with air quotes around it, scary black people.
You're saying that's what those Mondo films like Africa Dio were sort of saying.
Yes.
Okay.
The barbarians have been unleashed, so to speak. And I think that Cannibal Holocaust was using those preconceptions and then questioning them.
In a very, very bleak way, we should add.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the message of the movie is not that actually, no, the brown people are not really that scary. It's that no, the white people are also scary. That civilization is at some level um, an illusion or a contrivance that we've come up with in order to survive, but it doesn't necessarily lead us to be more civilized, so to speak.
When it comes to this film, do you think I mean, maybe we've already answered this in some ways, but how do you think the film could be understood in a political context?
Well, can you be more specific about that?
Well, I mean, it's obviously not some film that has an extremely high opinion of humanity. It's
No, it doesn't.
very like it has a grim view.
Hmm.
Um, so is it a very reactionary sort of
In
film
some
or
ways,
okay?
in some ways, I mean, if you want
But
to
it's
think of
also
it,
critiquing corporate media, which feels
yes,
like yeah.
it is. So if you want to look at it sort of on a left-right continuum, I think it kind of eludes some of those because on the one hand, if you want to look at it as like a leftist film, is this a leftist movie? Well, I wouldn't quite characterize it like that. Um, because what leftism and progressivism has usually been about is about imagining like human worth and dignity. And you start with the individual, and then you extend it out to your community, and then you extend it out to the state, the nation, and then you extend it out to the world, right? And about that gradual recognition of humanity. Now, Cannibal Holocaust is interesting in that it does suggest that equality between people in the developing world and people in the industrialized world, but it doesn't suggest that humanity is anything to brag about. So, uh, so looking at it from that way, if you look at it from a right wing angle, I'm not sure that it quite fits that way either. I mean, it does in some ways if you're one of the kind of person who views like all human beings are basically savage and what we have to do is defend ourselves. But I think if you have a sort of a more socially conservative point of view in which human life has inherent dignity, um, which is one of the places where I think progressivism and sort of uh, traditional American conservatism do actually intersect. Um, it doesn't really affirm that either, right? So, or is civilization and society something that is making us better? And maybe what Cannibal Holocaust is suggesting that that's impossible. The human nature is baked, and there's no changing it. And the native people take on a symbolic role representing what is sort of the baseline of humanity. And civilization and industrialization is a scaffolding that's built on that foundation. But ultimately, there's no getting rid of. There's no way to acknowledge. You have to acknowledge what the actual base is.
Yeah, it sounds like on one hand you have a critique of human nature that could be seen as very reactionary, but then,
Mhm.
like I said, you have the elements of, critiquing the corporate press that would be seen as very,
Mhm.
almost like lefty or progressive. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
very interesting film in that, in a lot of ways, you can read out of it what you want,
In
depending on what you
some
focus on.
ways,
Yeah.
in some ways, I don't think you can. I push back against that just a little bit because I
No, and
think
I
that
think that's fair that you're pushing back. Go ahead.
yeah, I think that we should caution against just in terms of film criticism in general about saying, well, a text can mean whatever you want it to mean. I think a text can mean what you can find evidence for. And I think there's a good case to be made here. You know, as far as the politics of Cannibal Holocaust, I think it's a bit elusive. I think it's a movie that makes enemies on all sides in a way because it doesn't tell anybody what they want to hear.
It's
Um,
very punk rock in a way.
yes, it is, and it is giving a middle finger to the audience actually. And I think to me that is why the film succeeds. Maybe not as entertainment, but as art. And I think that's one of the reasons why people get angry with it. You know, if you make something that's this sort of down and dirty and you don't try to do anything more with that, if you try to make Terrifier 3, you're just throwing blood and guts at the audience for the fun of it, then people will, they may not be to everyone's taste, but they'll kind of leave it alone. If you actually try to exceed your caste, exceed your social or artistic caste, then people get angry about that, I think.
I wanted to ask you about you mentioned earlier wanting to delve into the ways in which violence is portrayed in cinema versus the reality of violence.
Sure.
Yeah.
So part of the attraction we get from audio, violence is a very consistent part of our entertainment, right? Everything from cartoons to war movies to slasher pictures, and even a lot of comedy is actually very violent. But the way in which it's presented matters. And there's movies that are extremely gory, such as Terrifier, Evil Dead pictures, that go so far over the top that they become cartoonish and therefore entertaining and accessible to people. When we're looking at violence, uh, we generally don't want it to be realistic unless it's in a very specific way. If you're doing a war picture, then that's fine because there's a certain expectation of respectability from a war picture, especially when dealing with, say, Vietnam or World War II, because those films are often very they take on a very respectful manner towards the troops and all that, and that realism honors their sacrifice, or at least that's how it's I think operates. That's how it's understood. But in general, if violence in media and in a movie specifically is too real, then we can't enjoy it. That the feelings that we get from violence that is dramatized is different from the emotional reaction that we get from violence that is uh, real. The way that we experience it if we actually witness a shooting, or if we even see news footage of a shooting, that is different from the way that we experience John Wick, and we want those things to be different. Because if it becomes too real, then we have a different set of emotional reactions and we're not able to enjoy it. One of the things Cannibal Holocaust does, because it has the real animal killings in it, is that and shows them in gory detail, is that it suddenly is saying, wait a minute, we're going to show you actual blood and guts. And we're going to show you to this at a real scale. Even the murder of the dramatized murders of people are done in a quite similar way. And that I think makes people uncomfortable. It's not what they signed up for when they typically go to see a horror picture or any kind of violent entertainment.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's interesting because the movie is very different than say, well, I'll put it this way. You mentioned earlier uh the way in which it doesn't really let anyone off the hook at the end, you know.
Hmm.
The Western filmmakers are monsters, the media Westerners are monsters. But the natives aren't portrayed in a positive light either.
Yeah.
It's almost like the opposite of a movie like Death Wish or the Charles Bronson movies, where
Hmm.
Bronson is like the good guy that takes out these bad, uncivilized urban youths that are just out of control. It's sort of is saying, no, they're both monsters. They're all, and I think
Yeah.
you're right that probably does it needles at people that watch it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I have a better answer to what before I was talking about the how you might understand this as a right-wing film. And a right-wing or conservative entertainment usually has very clearly delineated roles as far as good guys and bad guys.
Right.
Doesn't
That's why I was mentioning Bronson. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, it doesn't deal in moral equivocation. Now, actually, I think the original Death Wish is actually a fairly morally ambiguous film,
I think
but
that's fair. Yes.
but
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
go into the sequels, it's a different story.
Right.
And yeah, I think that because Cannibal Holocaust has this morally nihilistic view that there's no hope, there are no heroes. The closest we're going to get to that is the closest we're going to get to that is the anthropologist, who is actually kind of an oddly passive figure through most of it. He confronts the documentarians by screening their footage and then confronts their bosses with what they've done and lodges his protest. But that's about as far as he can go. I think that it's not a particularly optimistic view, but in some ways, that's all you can do sometimes. When you're confronted by the 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 destruction and evil in the world, when you're destructed, when you're try to confront the Alan Yateses of the world, and also just the general violence of it. Sometimes all you could do is lodge your complaints and try to maintain your own integrity. And beyond that, you know, the world's a place that's full of destructive things and evil shit happening all the time. And you do what you can to safeguard your own integrity.
No, that's really interesting because I've heard some people try to criticize the Harold Monroe character as being too blasé at the end about everything. Who are the real cannibals? It's almost like people feel like he's not doing enough. Like, why isn't
Mhm.
he? But he really can't do anything. Like, he can only speak his truth.
Well,
Can you
he's
blame
got
him?
them right. He's gotten them to do what he wanted, which is to not give Alan Yates what he wanted. Alan Yates wanted to be famous and rich. Well, he wasn't going to get rich, but he wasn't going to become famous either because they're going to destroy the footage. Now, obviously, within even the conceit of the film, that footage has now leaked out and we've all seen it. But we also have seen the truth about Alan Yates and also about the corporate media who he works for.
In terms of what you were talking about with the tribes, can you talk about the actual tribes that appear in this film, the differences between reality and the fantasy we're seeing in the film, and the research that went into it? I know that's a multi-part question, but
Yeah, yeah. The Yakumo tribe is fictional. That they made up for the film. Uh, the Yanomama are an actual tribe of people who live on the border between Venezuela and Brazil. And they have an interesting history. The filmmaker, the anthropologist who's most associated with them is Napoleon Chagnon. He did a lot of very famous work on the Yanomama, and he published a book called Yanomama, the Fierce People. And his findings that were widely published at the time talked about how the Yanomama tribes were constantly at war with one another, about how they were um, misogyny and sexual violence were a common everyday place, uh, common everyday occurrence in their lives. Um, that infanticide was relatively common, um, and he just depicted this very warlike, violent, hostile culture. Now, there's another tribe that's depicted in the film called the Shamatari. The Shamatari are mentioned in Shagnon's work. They're actually a subset of the Yanomama people who live in a specific region. And Shamatari was a word that the other uh, tribes used to refer to them. But I was able to find passages and key words in the script and in the film that indicate that the screenwriter, Clerici, must have read these books. For example, the word uh, Shaki, uh, Bizazi, these are words that were specific to Shagnon's research, and but they appear in the script. I don't see how he would have come up with those words if he hadn't read these books. So we can understand Cannibal Holocaust as a sort of adaptation of Napoleon Chagnon through the lens of 1970s exploitation filmmaking. Now, Chagnon's work was extremely controversial, and other uh, anthropologists who spent time embedded with the Yanomama people have disputed his characterization of their lives and their culture. Um, Now that the Yanomama are more out in the open than they were 60 or 70 years ago, they have started to speak out for themselves and have objected to this. However, other people who've done work with the Yanomama have corroborated Shagnon's claims. And so that um, becomes a very complicated history there that in which our understanding of the native people intersects with and is inextricable from our understanding of the people who studied them. Now, there was a book called Darkness and El Dorado uh, by Patrick Tierney, which made a lot of accusations against Chagnon. And these were reviewed by the American Anthropological Association. Some of these accusations were credible, and some of them really weren't. So, for example, the book claimed that anthropologists started a epidemic among the native people. That was found to be wrong. On the other hand, there were real questions about the role anthropologists had in maybe incentivizing violence, whether they intended to or not, by offering them pots and pans and other kinds of manufactured products, and that they were maybe competing possibly uh, for and resulting in violent conflicts among tribes because of the introduction of these various manufactured goods. That not Chagnon or the anthropologists, but the missionaries gave them shotguns. And then the missionaries were and horrified to discover that the locals were then using the shotguns to kill each other.
Do you also want to talk a little bit about the depiction or the way the film deals with anthropophagy? I always mispronounce it. Anthropophagy?
Okay, that's cannibalism.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, anthropophagy is another word for cannibalism, and yeah, that's really interesting. It's another one of these areas that distinguishes Cannibal Holocaust from other films of its kind. So if you look at some of the movies that Umberto Lenzi made, for example, Eaten Alive and
Man
Cannibal
from Deep
Ferox,
River, was that one of the ones he did, or
he did that one
yeah.
as well, yes. But particularly some of the later films, which were nastier. Um, the native people will kill and eat people raw. They're almost acting like zombies. They just they're they're eating ravenously, and they kill people, they chop them up, and they start eating right away, and eating in a very animalistic manner. What's interesting about both of Deodato films, Last Cannibal World and then Cannibal Holocaust, is that when the cannibalism occurs at very specific places, and it's done in a way that suggests culture. So in Last Cannibal World, the victim who is eaten is sort of dismembered. They get rocks and they put him inside of a rib cage, and they put a stick in there to keep the rib cage from collapsing. This is evidence of culture. Within Cannibal Holocaust, um, the cannibalism is uh, very specific. There's not very much of it in the film at all, actually. Um, but it occurs first when we first see the Yakumo in the bush chewing on human beings, and then we find out that, oh, actually this was part of a ritual. And in fact, Chaco, the guide who's going to take Monroe, the anthropologist, into the jungle, says, oh, these guys are not actually cannibals. This is something that they would do only in sort of last resort circumstances. And then they go into the village, and then we don't really see cannibalism again until we get to the Yanomama people, and they're an enemy tribesman, one of the Shamatari warriors, has been killed and is eaten with Monroe. The the village headman takes out piece of the Shamatari warrior, and he shares it with Monroe, and it's essentially breaking bread with Monroe. And so, as I write in the book, the ethos of Cannibal Holocaust is you are who you don't eat.
I also wanted to ask you about how your book deals with post-colonialism.
Okay. Well, I guess that's not something I get into in depth.
Right.
Uh, I think we can. I mentioned earlier that I think there was a panic in some quarters of the West when colonialism was over about, oh, are these people going to come back out to get us? Now, obviously, that hasn't happened. It wasn't going to happen, but there was nevertheless, I think, a fear of that. And I think some of these movies they depict simultaneously the sense of uh, they depict the fear of the other, but they also, in the case of Cannibal Holocaust, are confessionals. You know, in some of the other pictures, I think there's a bit of projection going on. There's a long history of fear of sexual assault by, let's be honest, by black men, by black and brown men, perpetrated on white women. That you can see that in cinema going back to like Birth of a Nation, right?
Well,
And
yeah,
a lot of
even
time,
even with like the fear of like, oh, white slave trafficking and things
yes,
like that. Yeah, the
sure, sure.
yeah.
And this is a act of projection because, in fact, a lot of sexual assault was visited on black and brown people by whites by white cultures that colonialized them. So that figures into it. But I think one thing that's relevant, I think, is the title itself. I find interesting to consider. Cannibalism, the word cannibal is rooted in the conquest of the New World by the European explorers. So when the European explorers encountered the Carib people, they were said to engage in forms of man eating. And when the word Carib went back to Europe through mistranslation or whatnot, Carib became cannib, and we get cannibalism. And cannibalism gets used as a pretense to uh, conquer other peoples, and it becomes a shortcut to signify cultures that are either not civilized or whose civilization is decadent. And during the conquest period, that was used as a pretense to conquer and enslave all sorts of communities of people. Uh, and so it persists. The word cannibalism persists today, though, as a signifier of sort of the not the cannibalism exists today as a signifier of a lack of civilization or a civilization that has failed. You compare that with the word Holocaust. Well, what is Holocaust? Well, first of all, it's derived from a Greek word for burnt sacrifices. And, comes into popular usage due to the pogrom against the Jews during World War II. And I think that is particularly relevant. Obviously, we've had genocides before and after the Holocaust, but that particular event sticks out in people's minds and in the sort of imagination of Western civilization because it represents the failure of civilization. And specifically, it represents the realization that science and technology were not necessarily leading us to a better world. That the Holocaust against the Jews followed shortly thereafter by dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which gives us the term nuclear holocaust, um, shattered people's belief in science and reason. And so you've got cannibal and all the words, all the baggage that that word has, juxtaposed up next to Holocaust and all that has. And I think that becomes a really fitting title for the themes encapsulated in this film.
In the course of this conversation, I was thinking about another movie, and this may sound like an odd movie to parallel with, but I was thinking of the movie Freaks, the Todd Browning movie,
Mm,
because I think both are very subversive movies, in the sense that, Todd Browning's Freaks, I think it's much more sympathetic to the carny folk than maybe Cannibal Holocaust is with the tribes, but it
agreed.
does play this game where you're thinking the freaks in the title are the carny folks,
Yeah.
but really, by the end of the film, you realize, oh my God, the true monsters of this piece are the
Hmm.
normal looking beautiful people. It's a
Yes.
very subversive film in that sense, and I do think there's a parallel there with Cannibal Holocaust. There's very much a subversion going on, especially with the Alan Yates character. Do
Hmm.
you think that's a fair comparison to make, or?
I suppose, I mean, there is a show business element to both films, isn't there? And there's also an element of uh, narrative tropes. So people who were disfigured would have often been presupposed to be sort of morally corrupt as well. That's a long-standing tradition in storytelling. And yeah, Freaks definitely takes that in a different way. And also the audacity of using actually malformed people in Freaks. And there's an authenticity in that. Now, obviously, the people playing the natives in Cannibal Holocaust were not actually natives; they were locals, but they were being paid, to put on the uniform and act like natives during, they were to act in a certain way on set. And they who knows how they felt about it. There's some later films, like Cannibal Terror, which I think was directed by Jess Franco, and you could tell that first off, they didn't go to the Amazon; they went to just like a national park in Italy or somewhere else in Europe and shot this. And the natives are all white guys in war paint, and there's like scenes of them standing around looking at each other like, "What the hell are we doing here?" Whereas I think for the local actors, I don't want to speak for them too much, but based on the interview there's an interview in Callum Waddell's documentary, Searching for Cannibal Holocaust, in which he found some of the actors who'd been in the film, and they were like, it was just a job, and we thought it was kind of a lark. There's an interesting story. There was a movie called The Green Inferno that was made by Eli Roth a few years ago.
It's funny you mentioned that because I was going to ask you about that in a later question, but go on.
Okay. Uh, so that movie is supposedly Roth's tribute to Cannibal Holocaust, and it has a similar story. It's actually similar to some of the other cannibal films more than it is to Cannibal Holocaust, but they apparently they were using local people who had never seen a movie before to play the cannibalistic tribe. And so they said, well, we need to show them something to explain what a movie is. And so apparently they showed them Cannibal Holocaust. And the native people thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen, according to Eli Roth.
That is interesting.
Mhm.
I don't know what to make of that. What do you
Yeah.
make of it?
I think they just were like, this is goofy. What the hell is this? Who acts like this?
Well, what I was going to ask is, I was going to mention Green Inferno specifically, but how would you compare Cannibal Holocaust to the cannibal films that came after it? Because I don't think for my money at least, I don't think Eli Roth's Green Inferno holds a candle to Cannibal Holocaust. I think they're very different films, and I think there's
Yeah.
something more daring about Cannibal Holocaust in some
Oh,
ways. Yeah.
absolutely. I think politically and thematically, it's a much more interesting film. Um, Eli Roth's Green Inferno is, I think it's an interesting and worthwhile picture to watch. Although I think narratively, it actually has less in common with Cannibal Holocaust than it does with an early episode of South Park, where the kids go to the Amazon jungle. And if you watch that episode, I believe it's called Rainforest Schmainforest, it both in its politics and in its plot, it's remarkably similar.
What do you
Uh,
mean by that? Can you?
so in Eli Roth's Green Inferno is about a group of activists who go down to the jungle and they're going to stop uh, the destruction of the rainforest, and they chain themselves to the trees. And then they stop that, and then they end up getting kidnapped by a cannibalistic tribe that is going to like torture them and eat them. And this is a theme in Roth's films, namely Hostel, of sort of dumb, naive Americans going into places that they don't understand and getting into deep trouble. And the story of Spainforest episode of South Park is something similar, where they go down to the jungle, and then I believe, if I'm remembering this right, they get chased by either animals or cannibalistic natives or both, and then end up getting saved by the logging company. So Uh, yeah, I think politically and thematically, it's those two texts are actually much more similar and have much more in common with them than either one has to do with Cannibal Holocaust.
It's interesting too because I think Deodato actually has a cameo in the second Hostel film.
He does, yes. He plays the Italian cannibal.
Right.
I remember when that happened, I went to see the movie and I started laughing because I recognized Deodato right away, but nobody else did in the theater. So,
No, I was the same way. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Hostel because I had a very bad reaction to that film. I just felt like it was feeding into stereotypes about Eastern Europeans and
mhm.
like it just felt like it was feeding into like these frat boy fears of, or like conservative fears of, oh, like the weird Eastern Europeans can't trust them. And it really offended me in a way that like Cannibal Holocaust didn't necessarily. And I've never
Okay.
been able to figure out why that is because
Yeah.
Cannibal Holocaust, I think most people would view it as an offensive film, but I think I th there's just something about the auto critique of it. I think it's a very self-critical film, and in a way,
Mhm.
that makes Cannibal Holocaust more worthwhile to me in weird ways.
Yeah, I think the satire or well, Cannibal Holocaust is not a satire, but the thematic point, the political agenda of the film is much more interesting in Cannibal Holocaust, in part because it's more complicated and actually getting back to some of those contradictions that we had earlier. Like I mentioned, the film misrepresents Native people and it relies on some of those tropes of the dangerous, scary brown people. And it doesn't really refute those. It does use them, but it does so in a way that suggests that we need to rethink our own sense of superiority. And that complexity and those flaws are part of what makes it interesting. I think sometimes there's a desire in art for things to be clean and to make their arguments perfectly. And actually, it's the imperfections and the ragged edges that makes art interesting a lot of the time. Now, with Hostel, I think I actually do like the two Hostel films. I like the second one better. I think,
I'm the same way. I like the second one a lot better. And to
yeah.
be fair, I wanted to say this beforehand. I think there's two ways to view that film. You can either view it as like, oh, the crazy, creepy Europeans, or you can view it as like a revenge fantasy against American tourists.
Yeah, I suppose you can.
But you were gonna say about Hostel?
Oh, I think that the Hostel pictures work. I think because they have a more satirical style. I think Eli Roth does have a sense of humor
Yeah,
about
there's
himself.
definitely a lot of humor in the
Yeah,
second one
which
too.
Cannibal
Yeah.
Holocaust does not have. It's not a funny movie. But because of that, it gets a certain tone that flattens it a little bit, um, and but also makes it a little safer because of its excesses. I mentioned what I mentioned earlier about violence being so excessive at some point that it becomes sort of cartoony. I think that's the case in a lot of Eli Roth's pictures. And he comes from that same school of Tarantino, and Tarantino does that very much so. The violence in his pictures is way over the top, which is why I know some people get upset about violence in cinema for various reasons. But I think when it's presented in a certain way, it's in Tarantino's films especially, the artificiality of it becomes so obvious that it hits you in a different way emotionally. And it becomes, especially in something like Django Unchained or Inglourious Bastards, it becomes sort of self-aware.
One of the first sort of serious criticisms I found online of Cannibal Holocaust was someone was making the argument to me in a forum at one point when I was younger that the film is like I said an auto critique and Alan
Mhm.
Yates. I mean, they went as far as to say Alan Yates is almost like a stand-in for Deodato. I don't know
Mhm.
if I would go that far, but I was wondering what you think of that sort of argument.
I don't think that that's completely wrong.
Okay, I want to
Uh,
get into that then because I think that's
okay.
interesting.
Yeah. Does Deodato see himself as Alan Yates? Who knows? Who knows what Deodato thought? And does it matter? I don't. I don't give much credence to authorial intent. I'm more interested in what's actually in the text, whether the artist intended it or not. And I think that given the nature of the picture, given the way that the crew members and cast members were treated, there does seem to be something. I don't know if Deodato was aware of making this character a sort of exaggerated version of himself. I think he felt that he was making a critique of journalism that was uh, sensational and dishonest. But does Alan Yates and his ethos kind of reflect the nature of the film itself? In a way, sure, in a way it does. However, I think there's an important distinction, and that's that uh, Alan Yates is uh, ostensibly making a nonfiction ethnographic picture. That's what he claims to be making. And Cannibal Holocaust, no matter what you think of the inclusion of real animals or newsreel footage or whatnot, it's ultimately fiction. And so that has to be understood differently. You know, the criticism of the media through Alan Yates is interesting to consider now, in part because of uh, the 24-hour news cycle and some of that, but also in another way, like the documentaries that were produced by the Discovery Channel and Animal Planet of mermaids and the megalodon shark, and making stuff that was just nonsense and trying to pass this stuff off as though it was real and bamboozling a fair amount of the audience. You know, when the mermaids documentary came out, um, people started like calling up scientists and giving them death threats because they were hiding the secret of the mermaids. And so but I'm going off on a tangent here. So is Alan Yates, um, what does he represent in relationship to the film? I think I, I, I don't know what Deodato was thinking, and I don't want to speculate because what we have is the film. And I think that eh, the Cannibal Holocaust as a sort of meta narrative of this particular kind of storytelling, Alan Yates does become an exaggerated version of that kind of filmmaker. And Deodato, whether he realized it or not, probably did have something in common with him.
I guess so, not just with Deodato himself, but do you think the film almost works as, I mean, it's obviously criticizing sensationalistic journalism, but in
Mhm.
a way it almost works as a meta critique of just exploitation cinema, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
Not
I
just the
mean,
film itself, but yeah.
yeah, I mean, it is commenting on itself, but it's commenting on this genre of cannibal films. It's commenting also on that genre of Mondo pictures and other kinds of ethnographic films. Not only ones that were made by, the Mondo filmmakers, but ethnographic films that were made by supposedly serious anthropologists and others. And then commenting on, you asked me about master narratives. There it is. These stories of colonialism and fears of the other that we constantly find throughout both literature and film.
Do you think with that fear of the other, I feel like one of the main points of this film, and we've kind of hammered this a lot, is there's this encounter between the self. We see ourselves as, the people watching it, a lot of them are Westerners, right? So
Mhm.
they're watching it from that perspective. Um, and the other are these tribes, but really when they come to meet in this movie, they're mirror images of each other.
Yes, that's exactly the point.
So closing out here, what do you want my listeners to get out of this conversation about Cannibal Holocaust? Assuming I'm hoping that my listeners have stayed through the whole thing,
Mhm.
because I know talking about this movie can be difficult because when you're
It
talking
can.
about animal violence or even some of the um, scenes, the scenes, right? Like, I mean, they're burning down villages and gang
Mhm.
rape and all that stuff. I think a lot of people just will completely overlook any possible artistic merit to this film. So, what do you want to say to people that sort of, have trouble wrapping their head around it ethically? Because I think you can make ethical criticisms of the film while
Mhm.
also thinking there's artistic merit to it. And I don't know, how would you address that?
Well, I would say that if you're struggling about whether or not to engage with the film, then I would say you would need to make that decision for yourself. And fortunately, we live in an era of IMDb and Wikipedia and my book, where you can, in fact, find out what's in the film and read a summary of it. And yes, that'll spoil the plot for you, but you'll know what you're getting yourself into beyond the fact that the movie is called Cannibal Holocaust. So, uh,
I
if
think,
it's
by the way,
something,
too, for my listeners, not to interrupt you, but I think there's been a version released that has there's like cigarette burns happen whenever there's animal violence or some such. So
yeah, there is the Grindhouse releasing DVD and Blu-ray discs includes an animal cruelty-free viewing option. To me, that's not Cannibal Holocaust. Then if you've cut that out, then it's to me it is the equivalent of like removing the N-word from Huck Finn. It's like you've taken out an essential part of the text. And yes, it makes people feel more comfortable with it, but then you kind of missed the point. So if you're interested in finding watching Cannibal Holocaust, it is available. Um, I think what you need to ask yourself, not only with Cannibal Holocaust, but with anything, which is why am I watching this? I wish people would ask themselves that more about the media that they consume, just in general, whether it's a movie, whether it's a TV show, whether it's a YouTube video. Why am I watching this? And what is the filmmaker showing me? Why are they showing me these images? And what are the implications of that? And sometimes it's just merely prurient violence or it's just silliness. And there's room for, entertaining violence and in whatever tone it might take. But hopefully the art you're engaging with is doing more for you than that. And in the case of Cannibal Holocaust, I think if you're willing to persevere through it and you're willing to engage with it, you're going to find that there's stuff in it that is worth contemplating. And in fact, the difficulties of the film, whether it's depictions of sexual assaults and animal killings and its troublesome depictions of non-white people, are actually what make it interesting and worth wrestling with because these are not just images of a bygone era. These are images and ideas that have been relevant for centuries and will continue to be relevant for the foreseeable future. And that's worth wrestling with.
that ties into something I wanted to ask you here at the very
Okay.
end of the conversation. You mentioned seeing this film initially around the time of
Mhm.
the Iraq War. How relevant do you think this film was watching it at that time, during that time of the War on Terror, and during a time where, people were talking about the clash of civilizations,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of, I mean, I'll just put it bluntly, I just saw a lot of like real hatred
Mhm.
towards Muslims. There was a lot of Islamophobia. And I think Cannibal Holocaust, because I believe I saw it in that era as well for the first time. And I think it hit home because of what was happening in the real world with a lot of that. There was this mentality of it's us versus the world. It's the Westerners versus these, barbarians at the gates. And I think it was very relevant in that time.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's a theme there, right? That it hit in a particular moment when I happened to see it. And good and significant art will, of course, always feel like it was made for this moment, or at least it typically will. And that's not just political art. Like a great love song or tragic love story will hit you at any age. It'll hit you It'll play across generations because it hits to something essential in human experience. Now, in the case of Cannibal Holocaust, we're talking about the political notion of it, and I think that it hits both some fundamental fears that we have and that were not entirely unfounded because 9/11 had happened, right? And also that attack kind of unleashed and gave permission to a lot of sort of deep-seated fears that we had that were racial and cultural of people in other parts of the world and presumptions that we have about those people. And Cannibal Holocaust coming out when it did, or me seeing it when I did in about 2002, 2003, I think really highlighted certain anxieties that I had uh, about the media and about the culture, and as well as my own anxieties about other people. You know, I am as susceptible to those fears of the other as anybody else, and I think that that's um, you're kidding yourself if you think you don't. So seeing those things wrapped up together, I think, in this picture and done so in a way that was brutal. Um, I really think it hit the spot in a way that played for that particular moment.
I wanted to go back to something earlier in the interview. I wanted to ask you about, you said there was that difference between animal slaughter and animal cruelty. Could you
Mhm.
speak a little bit more to that and why you think that's an important point?
Yeah, well, when you're talking about animal cruelty, you're talking about torture. That's another word I see online in relation to this film, and I take objection to that. I put torture and cruelty in the same bin. You know, are the animals being mistreated? No, as long if you accept that animal slaughter is acceptable, you know, for food or other products, then you ought to be okay with the killings in Cannibal Holocaust.
Okay. I know that's going to be a controversial argument for some,
Mhm.
but
Some people would object to killing animals for the sake of a film. But then if you're killing them for food or for clothing or for medicine, what's the difference? Cinema is an industrial process, and so are these others.
I guess people would say though that one is for entertainment, one like that food or medicine is different because it's not for entertainment. But I guess you're saying on a technical level it isn't.
Well, I would argue it's for art, but maybe that doesn't make much difference. I mean, remember, there are um, artists who have used animal pieces in their art, whether it's bones and other, you know, animal products or certain. I mean, you could extend it out to paintbrushes, which are sometimes made with animal fur. But there are artists who have used blood and bones and other pieces of animals in their work. Are you going to make a distinction between that and Cannibal Holocaust? This gets into what I've been saying, which is that the part of what's interesting about Cannibal Holocaust is the way that it disrupts the way we tend to think about morality and ethics and a lot of other related topics.
Do you think in that regard the film I will say this, regardless of what one thinks about the animal slaughter, I it's not the first film that did this.
No.
I mean, I believe there's even a Disney film that did this called White Wilderness,
Yes.
can you speak
And
to that?
oh God, White Wilderness won an Academy Award for Best Documentary. It contains a scene in which lemmings leap off a cliff, and some of them die, some of them drown. This scene was fabricated. The First of all, the scene's supposed to take place in the Arctic. It wasn't shot in the Arctic, it was shot in Canada. And then it was later revealed that the filmmakers were basically chasing or pushing the lemmings off the cliff.
They were trying to make it sound like it was supposed to be showing lemmings committing mass suicide, but they're literally pushing them off the cliff
Yes.
essentially. Okay.
Yes.
So they're committing animal murder there. Yeah.
Mhm. And again, it's in service of this thing. Now, I because that is an actual documentary, I don't. I think I take maybe more issue with that because it's actually dishonest. Then it's in the realm of I mentioned um, the Megalodon documentary that Discovery ran, or the Mermaids documentary, all these sorts of things, which are just fundamentally dishonest. And I think we can take an ethical hatchet to these films.
Do you think there's also an issue of just ethics then being different than ethics now? What I mean by
Well,
that is, there's a lot more effort put into there not being uh, animal murder or animal cruelty in a film. When at the time this was made, that wasn't necessarily the case.
yeah, well, I mean, the way that filmmakers create movies, and the way that any artist works is going to be relevant relative to what is deemed acceptable at the time. And that's going to have to do with animals. It's going to have to do with the treatment of people. It's going to have to do with the images that they put on the screen. And Cannibal Holocaust came out, I think, at a period of transition when people were having a changing opinion about that, which is why you wouldn't, I'd say you wouldn't see animal killings in movies, but have you seen the original Old Boy?
I have seen Old Boy, yeah,
Yeah. There's the scene of the character eating the octopus.
that's true. Yeah.
Anthony Bourdain did an episode of his show that where they cut out the heart of a snake and ate it. Is there a difference between that and Cannibal Holocaust? Is there a difference between what Cannibal Holocaust is doing and the hunting and fishing shows that are broadcast on television? Because that is killing animals for entertainment.
See, that's a actually really persuasive argument that I haven't thought about. Oh my
Mhm.
God.
So yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there's this argument that yeah, in a Hollywood film would not kill an animal on screen anymore like that, not intentionally anyway. Um, but and why wouldn't they? Because PETA and the ASPCA and Twitter and everything else would be all over them. I maintain that Disney and Universal and the rest of them are corporations, and they would make snuff films if they could make Avengers money with it.
Okay, I see so you're not even necessarily arguing what you think the ethics should be of this. You're saying, well, these are businesses. This is what they would do if they could get away with it.
Yes.
Okay. So, in closing here, how can my listeners get a copy of the book, and what do you want them to get out of this conversation we've had
Okay.
about Cannibal Holocaust?
Well, first about the book. So it's published by Lexington Books, which is an academic press. And so as a result, the book is somewhat expensive. There is an ebook version that is significantly more affordable than the hardcover. If you want to spend the money, I of course invite you to do that. But if you find that the book is outside your price range, um, contact your local library and ask them to purchase a copy. It may help if you have a few of your friends go to the library as well and make that request so that they have a few uh, requests in for the book, and then that will motivate them to buy a copy of it. Otherwise, though, it is available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble and your friendly neighborhood bookseller if you still have one.
And what's the one point, if there was one point you wanted them to take away from this, my listeners?
If there's just one point I want them to take away from this,
Or if there's a few points, like what are the main points you want my listeners to
yeah,
take away?
I hope, as far as Cannibal Holocaust itself is concerned, that there is more to this movie than initially meets the eye and more than its reputation suggests, and that it's worth engaging with. And that goes, I think, for a lot of other media, that there are there's art to be found out there that exists in sort of the seedy corners of the world, in both cinema and in other forms. And I think that those places are worth exploration, both by the your average everyday moviegoer and by academics, who I think could do well to start interrogating some of these unseemly pictures and really exploring and finding some interesting new insights into the culture and into filmmaking.
If I could just comment on that really quickly.
Sure.
It's interesting. I was arguing with someone recently about that new Demi Moore movie, The Substance, that came
Hmm.
out this year or late last year. Uh, and they were saying, people want to view it as an art film, but it's just this 70s exploitation film. And I got kind of annoyed and I said, there isn't necessarily as hard a line between exploitation movie and whatever you want to consider a high art movie, because
Hmm.
in general, 99% of movies released, I would say, are commercial movies meant to make a profit. They're not,
Yes.
just meant to be an art piece at a gallery. And I think people overlook a lot of times that, there's a lot of interesting films out there that get called exploitation that
Hmm.
have a point to them or do have
Yes.
social commentary, whether it's a Larry Cohen movie or a George Romero movie or even Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust.
Yes.
And you can comment on that, and then we'll close on that.
I think there is a freedom that artists find when they work just outside the mainstream that you can't have working in a studio system, especially a 21st century studio system in which things are now owned by these international corporations and nobody can make a movie for less than $150 million. So I think there's a lot of creativity out there, in the height of the exploitation era in the 1970s, but also now. There's been a lot of great stuff made in the last year. Uh, but a lot of the great stuff is not necessarily what's being put out on 3,000 screens on a Friday. There is some great stuff being put in wide release too, but uh, if there's great art to be found, if you know where to look for it.
But to that specific point, do you think people have drawn too? Do you think sometimes people draw too much of a line between
Oh
exploitation and art?
yes,
Okay.
yes, and that has been, I think, it's an issue that academia in particular is starting to confront. Uh, I think we have to recognize. I've talked about this in commercial terms, but there's another angle to this, which is to do with the museums and the canon that has been closed, but is now starting to crack open. And that it's worth dealing with some of these kinds of films.
What do you mean by cracking open? In what way?
Well, I think that we're going to start seeing more and more articles and books, hopefully like the one I've written, that are dealing substantively with movies that are outside of traditional sort of academic canon. We're I don't know how many more PhD theses need to be written about Citizen Kane. Have we said what? Not that it's not a great movie, because of course it's an important film, but how many more times do we need to analyze that film? I mean, I suppose do it if you have something new to say, but I think that sometimes can come at the cost of looking at some of these other pictures. There's been very little written about the Italian cannibal genre, for
I
instance.
definitely, by the way, I do see that changing. I know even like a few years ago, I remember there was a book similar to yours, but about a different film. MIT Press released a book on I Spit on Your Grave. And
Okay.
I was surprised at the time, but I think that your book, that book, I do think there's more openness in
Hmm.
academia now about trying to critically analyze these films.
Yeah, and I hope that continues because I think there's a lot of interesting work. You mentioned Larry Cohen. I think some of his stuff is really interesting. I think he's John Carpenter gets a lot of credit and rightfully so, but some of the stuff Larry Cohen did in movies like The Stuff,
Oh, the stuff is like very subversive.
satirizing mass market products and the corporate control of our lives, I think is really interesting.
Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you again, Nathan Wardinski, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope we can have another conversation in the future if you have another book out or just to talk about movies again.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon. who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.